Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the service here at Michigan Center Bible Church. With what's happening in our culture today, we are not open, and we'll be doing this live. We're in our book of Ecclesiastes doing our series. I'm thankful that you're able to tune in, but I'm also want us to be cognizant that we should be praying, obviously, for what's happening in our nation and for those around the world that are suffering from this virus. So I'd like to start with a word of prayer. Gracious Father, thanks for who you are, and we know that you're in control of all things. And here we are, facing a virus that has brought much fear into our world and caused super schedule changes in people's lives. I pray, Father, that we would be ready to minister to those who are in need. That, Father, we'd be more dependent upon you as we go through this. And Father, we're asking that you would please allow this to pass quickly. And we ask this in Christ's precious name. Amen. So we're in the book of Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is a journal of a man who is pursuing every conceivable avenue to find a personal satisfaction. But because he left God out of his quest, he ultimately found that life was meaningless under the sun. So I'd ask you to take your Bibles and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And as you're turning there, I'd like to tell you that we're going to talk about life is not fair. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but if you've ever heard that phrase before, Ecclesiastes is a book for you. It's an interview with the most powerful, richest man who ever lived, yet he was frustrated in his personal life. I came across this illustration. You aren't really a parent until you have at least 2 children. When you have one child and you walk into a room and find a lamp broken, it's difficult for the only child to say, "It wasn't me." The father found himself in an uncomfortable position of having to arbitrate a dispute between his 2 young sons. The argument was about to boil over into a fight when he decided to step in, hoping that he would call on the wisdom of Solomon. Back and forth the accusations went, accompanied by finger-pointing and name-calling. He started it. No, he did. Did not. Did too. After a little while, the father realized that no matter how much active listening he did, there was no way he was going to end up in a win-win situation. So he made a decision. "Okay," he said, with all authority he could muster, "both of you, go up to your rooms and stay there till you can act like brothers should." Just as he was feeling displeased with himself, he became the target of the son's anger. "No fair," the youngest one protested. "He started it. I didn't. He always gets everything." The older one protests. "Why should I get punished? It was his fault. He's such a baby about everything. You're not fair." It had turned into a lose-lose situation. Finally, totally at his wit's end, the dad summed up all the fatherly muster he could and said, "Hey kids, life is not fair. Live with it and get to your rooms now." Someone has said, some people don't deserve what they get, and some people don't get what they deserve. Terry Gimlin says, "Life is not always fair. Sometimes you get a splinter sliding down a rainbow." Bill Gates says, "Life is not fair. Get used to it." Last week, Pastor Jonathan took us through Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we looked at time, and time is unpredictable, and time is methodical, and time at times is harsh. But Solomon also told us that God makes everything beautiful in his time. So to those who have made a righteous decision to follow the sacrifice of Jesus Christ through faith. So Solomon's conclusion was, time is a gift from God. Enjoy what he has provided. Prepare for what lies ahead in eternity. We also are reminded that God is sovereign. This is where we're going to jump into our lesson today. So if God is sovereign, I want you to think with me, if God is sovereign, why do things happen that seem to thwart his plan? Walter Kaiser said this: anomalies must be used by us, anomalies must not be used by us to deny God's plan. Solomon has a series of complaints that he's going to go through. So if you're in chapter 3 with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, look at verse 16 and 17. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I thought in my heart, God will bring to judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time for every deed. So the complaint is this: courts are corrupt, they're unjust. Life just isn't fair. Verse 16 tells us that where there's supposed to be judgment, there's wickedness. Verse 17 tells us that God is going to bring justice to both the wicked and the righteous. Remember, anomalies must not be used by us to deny God's plan. If God is sovereign, then why? Look at chapter 3, verses 18 through 21. I also thought, as for men, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits both of them. As one dies, so dies another. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is meaningless. Verse 20, all go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust they will return. Who knows that the spirit of man rises upward, and the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So the complaint is this, that death is coming to all, both humans and animals. Life just isn't fair. In verses 18 through 21, we see that death is the great leveler of living beings. It brings great pain, it brings great sorrow. In Solomon's time, there were no hospitals. In Solomon's times, there were no senior citizen homes in Jerusalem. No rest homes established. The sight and sounds of death, the smell, was every day. Most people in this day would die in their family home. Death was not only inevitable, but death was evident in every day of life. And in verse 19 of chapter 3, he says, man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. What is that? The grave. We are made from dust, Genesis chapter 2, and we will return to dust. Genesis chapter 3, verse 19 says this, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. Mankind was intended to eat from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden and live forever. But we all die because of the sin committed by Adam and Eve. Death equalizes animals and humans. Death is inevitable. What this teaches us is that mankind is not immortal. There will be a time of death. Just like we read back in chapter 3, in the very beginning of chapter 3 last week, for a season for every activity under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. God wanted us to live forever here on this earth, but sin canceled that. Anomalies must not be used to deny God's plan. And if God is the sovereign, then why? Another complaint comes up in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And again I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. And I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. So Solomon has this, in chapter 4, we're going to see the word better 4 times. And in this first part here, he said it's better that you're not even born with what's happening with the oppression. Oppression of God's people just isn't fair. Life's not fair. How can God be in control if his own people are being oppressed? Man would be better off dead or never been born instead of face such evil. People who do cruel things to each other, and no one can stop it. No one can make the oppressed feel better or set things right. The oppressors do as they please. The people that we are elect are supposed to uphold justice, set things right, and pass laws to protect the hurting. But they're the ones that ultimately end up doing the oppressing. The problem is that power corrupts. So even if someone sees the evil of the system and gets involved with the desires to reform things, once they have the power, they are then often corrupted and nothing changes. Politicians, judges, the rich oppress the poor, the outcast, who have little, if they have any type of recourse. The unborn child, a life is extinguished because of the choice of those in power. The slave-traded little girl, sex traffickers pay off police officers to look the other way. What this teaches us is that evil affects everyone's life. Anomalies must not be used by us to deny God's plan. But God is sovereign. But if he is sovereign, then why? Chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. And I saw all the labor of all the achievement spring from the man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hands and ruins himself. Better one handful of tranquility than 2 handfuls of toil and a chasing after the wind. So the complaint here is that hard work, no matter how hard you work, there's going to be those who are jealous and those who are envy, and that those who are idle cannot find their own happiness, so they're envious for those who toil. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's better, it says, to be content with the handful you have than to be consistently working for more, because others will be envious of what you have. What this teaches us is that possessing more does not stop covetousness. Then we see the complaint in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And again I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? And this too is a meaningless, a miserable business. So in verse 7 and 8, we see a man who didn't need others. He's working and not content with everything that he's gathered. So he doesn't have a brother, he doesn't have a son, and he keeps toiling, and it comes to him, why am I doing all this toiling instead of enjoying things? But he can't stop. What this teaches us is this life is not meant to be lived alone. Solomon's response is a proverb that we read in verses 9 through 12. Here we go. Verse 9. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. So if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So Solomon's response to these complaints that he has this proverb that he writes, and he talks about that 2 are better than 1. The contrast of that greedy man who's all alone, Solomon tells us that we need others, that 2 are better than 1. The 2 speaks not just of a couple that are married, but it's also about relationships between individuals. 2 is the minimum number needed for a relationship, so it is used to describe what Solomon is speaking of. Solomon essentially was denouncing the value of getting what he wanted in life with disregard for those around him. Solomon essentially was denouncing the value of getting what he wanted in life with disregard for those around him. His pursuit of life rather than God's will. So I want you to think with me, no doubt, like many of us would say, that degree, that life, that goal is God's will. That we see something and say, this is God's will in my life. I've been praying about this, and this is what God's will is. I would suggest to you that when it has happened, I would suggest that when it has happened that someone's hidden independent spirit is pushing for that to happen, it's no longer God's goal. God has given each person a special task that God has planned for him and her alone. But the question is whether the individual would compromise God's ways to get what they think God wanted. Does the ends justify the means? Abraham had a worthy goal of being a great father for God, but he compromised his reliance on his own resources and had sexual intimacy with Hagar that turned into not being God's will. We have to make sure that we don't have some hidden independent spirit that can no longer align with what God's will is. So I want you to think with me, do people do things in unloving ways to get a task accomplished? Of course they do, all the time. So we see in this little passage that we have some teamwork happening, right? Two are better than one. And the whole idea about good return and that if you fall down, if you need to have some warmth, if you need to have power. So two are better than one. When anyone utilizes this truth, they will be blessed. So let me ask you, what is the difference between teamwork and a group of people? They both have 2 or 5 or whatever number of people. Solomon is speaking of the synergy of spirit that happens when people are living with the same common purpose. That should be the church, should it not? That we should be the same common purpose. Our purpose should be that we're taking the gospel to the whole world. Our purpose should be that we are living our lives for the glory of God and Him alone. Our purpose should be synergized. We should be together in that. The word synergy is made up of 2 Greek words that means to work together. They're not living in context for themselves, but for the good of the whole. We want to have a desire to make sure that we're accomplishing what we need to together, and that is to bring God glory. So with this in mind, in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 4, we have this greedy man that we just talked about in verses 7 and 8. And then Solomon comes back and tells us that our 2 are better than 1. The question has to be asked, why are 2 better than 1? And he gives us 4 different ideas. In verse 9, because they have good return for their work. That's production. That's production. They can produce more. They can get more done together. We realize that when we have a task to be done, a large task to be done, that many hands make light work. But we realize we can get more done that way. We also see in verse 10, if one falls down, his friend can help him up. Protection. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him. We realize that if we have a synergy together, we realize that we have teamwork together, that we have protection as well. And then we see in verse 11 the idea of provision. If 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? When I was in elementary school, I was in the Boy Scouts. And one year for the Boy Scouts, when I was in it for 2 years. And one year when we decided we were going to go on a camping trip, and it was early spring. It was early spring. It wasn't any leaves on the tree. It was early spring. And we decided that we were going to be clever, our troop were going to be clever, so we made our own tents. And what we did is, he got some plastic that was quite thick in this mill, and we put fiber tape on the edges as we made a rectangle, and then we were able to put a fiberglass tape down the middle, and we were able to put some posts up there. And so we had this open tent where we could slide under. If the ends were open, you could slide under. And we were going to camp out on those for a couple nights. My mom had bought for me a sleeping bag with green stamps. If you remember what green stamps are at my age, you probably remember that. You used to get those at the grocery store. You could trade those for things. And she got a sleeping bag for me. I never had a sleeping bag, and she was able to purchase one with the green stamps. And I think that it was rated to be warm at 65 degrees and above. It was really thin. It was really thin. And we're on this early spring, and the guy that was supposed to come with me didn't come. I can't remember why. He was sick, or his parents decided no. It was a kind of a rainy, cool weekend, that Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. And so I was in my tent by myself, and I want to tell you, I was freezing. So next to me were two of my friends in their tent. I asked if I could join them, and I went over to that tent and was able to get some warmth from being together. I wanted to be in the middle with my 65 degrees, but they wouldn't let me do that. But it was cold. But the idea that provision can happen. Provision can happen in more ways than heat, though, right? Provision can happen when people are in need of food or need of shelter, that we have that goal together. And then in verse 12, he talks about power. The one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. The idea of a cord of 3 strands, that's used a lot in weddings, where the two of the strands stand for the husband and the wife, the bride and groom, and the third one stands as Christ, and you wrap those together, and yet it's strong. And we know that when we wrap cords together, it does make them strong. It can be used in a marriage, but the truth of the matter, Solomon wasn't thinking about marriage here. He was talking about protection, power, right? That they could defend themselves. And the idea, again, that there is protection with 2, but 3 is even greater. It's even better to have 3. Then he comes back with one more complaint here in verse 13. And the word better shows up again. Better a poor but wise youth than all old but foolish king who now no longer knows how to take warning. The youth may have come up from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were there before him. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is a meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Here we have the idea that it doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich, that you live in a high or low position, that you're intellectually gifted or if you're dumber than a stick. It doesn't make any difference in what's happening in your position, because people are fickle. And they're going to follow the next better leader, the better communicator, the better innovator. The next generation will go down and play and ignore and deny all the accomplishments that the other one did. Remember that flattery is fleeting, right? Let me give you an illustration. Would you please take your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. And we're going to start in verse 13. And this passage is talking about money. But look what happens here. Mark 12, verse 13. Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians, 2 groups that don't usually get along, right? To Jesus to catch him in his words. And they came to him and said, notice that they wanted to catch him in his words. And they came to him and said, Teacher, we know that you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. But you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Listen to that flattery, right? They're setting him up for a trap. They think we're going to get him. And then they ask the question, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? Remember that interpret the Bible in the day it's written. Here we have the Roman occupation, and they're demanding taxes. And the Jews are saying we shouldn't be supplying money to these guys. We should, we give it to the Lord in his temple, but we shouldn't give money to these guys. And he's trying to trap Jesus. Are you going to endorse the Roman government? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he said. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." And they brought the coin, and he asked them, "Whose portrait is this? And whose inscription?" "Caesar," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. The flattery came in to try to get Jesus all looped up that we're going to trap him. Flattery is fleeting. So we have this idea that we have this, verses 13 through 16, that popularity is only temporary, right? It only lasts for a little while, and then people are going to forget. Think of those who were beauty pageants or were recognized because of their beauty. Think of people who had great skills, and those who have accomplished many things. Most of those people that have done things before us, we don't even know who did it, or we have forgotten who's done it, because the popularity has finished them. Better to be living as God is in control than man is in control. So what's the application we can learn from today? Here's the lessons learned. Live life knowing that God is sovereign and that He is in control. God is in control of all things, even what's happening in our culture today. God is in control. He's not left the throne. He's allowing this to happen. Sometimes we don't know why. But we live in a sinful and evil world. Our only hope is found in Jesus Christ and Him alone. Another application is live life contented with what God has blessed you. Can we be content? Our flesh will consistently desire more. Scripture tells us about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We need to live with eternity in view. To be content, Paul says, to be content in whatever state I'm in. It's a tough battle. We're battling the flesh every day. I need to be content with what God has entrusted me with, that I am a steward of. The last one is this: live life connected to the people God has placed in your life. Live life connected to the people God has placed in your life. Man was not born to be in isolation. All the way back to the Garden of Eden. Adam was created. God said it's not good for man to be alone. We need each other. We need each other for production. We need each other for protection. We need each other for provision. And we need each other for power. We need each other. Scripture teaches us this in Ephesians chapter 4. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Jesus says, you will know my disciples by their love. We need to be loving, that sacrificial, not self-satisfying, sacrificial love. 1 Peter says this: above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. We have to love each other, warts and all, right? We have to love each other knowing that some of us are going to fail at times. And then Jesus said this in John 15, my command is this, to love each other as I have loved you. We need to make sure that we're connecting with each other, that we're not just loving each other in word, but in deed and in presence. When that person is hurting in the hospital, we need to be there. When that person doesn't have the finances, we need to be there. When that person has a wayward child, we need to be there. We are this and this together. And Solomon, in his wisdom, said, I saw all these things, and they don't make sense. But God is in control of all things. Let's pray. Gracious Father, are we living our life better? Or are we living our life in futility? Are we living our life in the temporary? Or are we living our life in light of eternity? I pray, Father, that this time we will take the opportunity to delve deep into our motives, to confess to you where we want to be in control and not you. Teach us to love you with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, with all of our minds. Let us be followers of Jesus. We ask it in His name. Amen.